Before we begin, I'd like to pay my respects to my teacher, the Most Venerable John May Consunim. Today's Dhamma talk is on the expansion of Buddhism in India. And in order to get a grasp of these turbulent times, we need to consult three maps. Map 1 shows us the subcontinent at 500 BCE, predating the Buddha's birth. The first thing one notices is the large number of political identities based upon clans. Some of these were republics, but most were kingdoms. Map 2 is in 400 BCE, at the time of the Buddha's Parinibbana. Notice two things on this map. The number of political identities has decreased, and this requires a decrease in clan importance and an increase in king authority. Let's move on to map 3, which is the peak of the Nanda dynasty. The Nanda dynasty was replaced with the Mayura dynasty in 322 BCE. 10 years later, King Ashoka took the throne. By this time, most of the subcontinent was under his rule. Given these circumstances, the question then becomes, what were the influences both externally and internally on Buddhism at this time? The external factors can be broken down into 5 distinct but not mutually exclusive categories. And they are political, economic, social, religion, and geography. Let's begin with the political. And when we're speaking of political, we're speaking of power. Some of these areas were obtained by political intrigue. Some of these territories were obtained by fear and intimidation, and still others were obtained by war. And wars lead to a breakdown of external and internal trading, but most importantly, food distribution. And people went hungry. And if one survived, one could find their livelihood gone. And these types of disruptions occurred at all levels of society. This leads us to number 3, the social implications. Now we have to remember that this area in particular had been relatively stable for generations, and these disruptions tore at the very fabric of society. And under these conditions, both Buddhism and Jainism expanded quickly, with Buddhism finding itself in the dominant position by the time of King Ashoka. As you can see, we're now moving into our next category, religion. The Brahmins, who were still highly respected in society, were nonetheless losing favor with the general populace and also with the royalty. So what they did is they changed tactics, and they moved to become more sensitive to the needs of the everyday lives of the people. And this in and of itself had an influence on the development of Buddhism in the northern area. The last category on our list is geography, and for that we need another map. Let's divide the country in two, here at the Narmada River. At this point, we can speak of a northern development and a southern development. The two are occurring simultaneously, but relatively independent of each other. Notice these areas are separated by hundreds of kilometers, so interaction between the two was certainly limited. Just as things start to settle down, guess who shows up at the northern border, close to the Indus River? That's right, Alexander the Great. He arrives in the year 326 BCE. However, his men balk at continuing the campaign in India. Alexander rescinded, turned back, and died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 33. Why is this important? Because this area would be under Greek influence for centuries to come. Notice that these external influences are quickly becoming internal influences, especially in the northern area. It's good for us to remember that the southern region was less affected by these influences that we've outlined so far. Of the many internal influences affecting Buddhism at this time, I would like to focus upon two in particular. Because of the rapid expansion of Buddhism, it attracted people from other groups that weren't doing so well. So by the time King Ashoka took the throne, apparently there were a lot of questionable monks in the Sangha. So what he did is he asked his head monk, Maglipudlatissa, to purify the Sangha. The way he did this was kind of interesting. He set up a curtain and he interviewed the various monks as to their views, and if their views were not in accordance with the Buddhist teachings, they were asked to leave the Sangha. A second internal influence I'd like to discuss that was occurring at this time is a friction was beginning to develop between the more solitary wilderness monks and the more urban or monastic monks. And this had to do with one's conception of purity of practice. So it's not surprising then that the protocols, the training, the interpretations of teachings all developed in a more dynamic fashion in the north than that noted in the more stable southern region. And out of this convergence of causes and conditions, many of which we haven't even touched upon, arose Mahayana Buddhism. In our next Dhamma talk, we'll be discussing the expansion of Buddhism in Asia, the Mahayana tradition moving in a northerly route, predominantly using the Silk Road, and the Theravada tradition moving out across oceanic trade routes. Be well, my friends.